It is widely believed that children are taught their first language, but much like how our legs and the shape of our feet are designed for the acquisition of an upright pose and subsequently the capability to walk, so too are we born with the tools necessary to acquire language, not through instruction, but innately and through experience. Children whose acquisitional processes are unimpaired all develop at roughly the same rate the world over, regardless of the language they are exposed to or the culture and circumstances surrounding them. At around 6 months, they will begin to babble. Babbling, though thought to begin with the most common and thus easiest to reproduce sounds, can result in a child being capable of such diverse range of ultimately meaningless articulation that its scope and variation cannot be found in any single known language. However, when the child graduates to actual speaking, those phonetic elements not found in their environment will usually disappear. This can be compared to someone picking up an instrument with no knowledge of musical theory or how to play it correctly and fooling around creating strange, undetermined noises before ultimately learning how it is supposed to be played and sticking to the scales. As the phonetic range diminishes, the child retains those phonetic elements found in the language they are exposed to, suggesting that babbling is part of a natural progression, much like crawling before walking. Throughout history, it has been questioned what would happen if a child was never exposed to language. The obvious unethical nature of this has seen it rather dramatically termed the forbidden experiment. Nevertheless, there are instances where it has been attempted, but these are mostly about despotic rulers searching for their god, rather than any serious scientific investigation. So for the nearest situational predicament, one might look to the deaf. A very interesting example of how children absorb the language around them and make it their own can be found in the hearing-impaired children of late 1970s Nicaragua. At the very first school for the deaf in the country, the curriculum of lip reading and speech was deemed a failure, and yet the children, most of whom had never interacted before and who had used differing versions of sign language at home, began to pool their respective gestures into a system that became known as Lenguaje de Signos Nicaraguanese, mercifully abbreviated as LSN. LSN is what is known as a pidgin language, a system of communication shared between people who do not share a common language. As with most pidgins, LSN featured a stunted vocabulary and reduced grammatical structure. But as younger children joined the school and took on the language, they expanded and refined both the vocabulary and grammar to the point that it is referred to by a different name, Idioma de Signos Nicaraguanese, or ISN, which can be called a Creole language, that is, a fuller language that is developed from a pidgin. LSN developed into ISN in less than a decade and now has over 3,000 native speakers. This evolution occurred through an instinctive compulsion for children to add structure and complexity to a language where there was none. However, children over the age of 10 who learned the language in its pidgin form had some difficulty keeping pace with its growing complexity, it being mostly the younger adopters that were able to learn and often invent new constructions. So why did this happen? If the children had not been exposed to full languages before, why did they instinctively fill in the gaps and thus elevate their pidgin to a Creole? This leads us to the work of Noam Chomsky, and specifically the innateness hypothesis. In his 1965 work, Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, Chomsky hypothesized that we are born with certain grammatical rules or structures hardwired into our brains, that even though you may be hearing a certain combination of words for the first time, you will still know if it is grammatically correct or not. The famous example he gave is the phrase, "Colourless green ideas sleep furiously." It is, taken literally as Chomsky intended, ultimately meaningless, and yet it sounds correct to us because, grammatically, it is correct. And so the mind looks for the meaning in it. In contrast, rearranging the words to "furiously sleep ideas green colourless," it remains nonsensical, yet without grammatic structure, it is jarringly so. It simply sounds wrong. This forms the basis of the universal grammar theory, that an unconscious set of rules embedded in our brains dictate what is structurally correct and what is not, and that where these rules are lacking, such as in the case of the pidgin to Creole example of the deaf children of Nicaragua, we, particularly in our formative years, will fill any gaps until our language conforms to this grammar. This has been much disputed and argued about, with a good many opposing theories still appearing some 60 years later, yet the innateness hypothesis has yet to be properly usurped. What Chomsky's theory did was expand linguistics out of being a completely social science and into the realms of evolutionary biology and neuroscience. For my part, I'm surprised it wasn't considered as such previously, seeing as how, disregarding the workings of the mind, the human body is set up with the apparatus, the lungs, the velum, glottis, for speech. But just as the tongue is vital for the chewing and swallowing of food, and the glottis helps prevent us from choking, separate from their uses as speech organs, so too exists the possibility that our capacity for language acquisition and retention utilizes pre-existing neurological functions. Drastically simplified, there are two types of memory, declarative and procedural. The declarative memory learns and connects arbitrary information, facts, events, things that can be declared. The procedural memory governs motor skills and cognitive sequences and acquires them through repetition until they eventually become automatic, such as riding a bike or playing an instrument. The acquisition of language requires interaction between these two types of memory. Firstly, the acquisition of words and their syntactic, morphological, and phonological features in the declarative memory. Then, in the procedural memory, the placing of new words within a grammatical structure and the practice of this until automatic. In summation, people are not taught their first language, but acquire it through innate biological mechanisms, complemented by usage and repetition.